So I'm Ryan McVeigh with Zia Consulting. In the spirit of full disclosure, I'll tell you that I have full responsibility for sales of our ECM practice at Zia. And you'll hear a conversation today that's reasonably technical. I have a technical background in my past, but I'll tell you that as those days go by, I forget more and more every day on writing software. So I realize my audience here is a technical audience. But by all means, raise hands, ask questions, please, and happy to chat with you on what I'm going to share as we go and afterwards. So from an agenda perspective, really what I'm going to try to share with you today is a series of integration conversations. We talked about content-connected enterprise, we talked about paper to mobile. What you'll hear me tell you is there are a number of stories with customers that we're working with around Alfresco that are building blocks or pieces of that overall puzzle. And I'll share with you a handful of those that I think are very interesting and supportive use cases around how Alfresco is used in the enterprise. The problem as we see it at Zia is that content is everywhere. And so, we're all familiar with ECM. We're certainly all familiar with Alfresco, and we understand what that means in the scope of solving content management problems. But if you think a bit more broadly, beyond what content exists in your repository, you can quickly find lots and lots of use cases of content that's not yet managed by a repository. Anything from paper, obviously we're going to talk about that today, to content that might sit in a CRM system or an ERP system or something non-traditional that you might not think of as you're thinking about document or content management. We've addressed a lot of those problems through a solution that we're calling the Content Connected Enterprise. You'll hear me explain bits and pieces of this solution throughout the conversation today. What we've done is built a solution around Alfresco being what we'll call our content hub, and then we've built building blocks that connect these pieces together. And I'll also tell you that I don't have a single customer at this moment that implemented everything you see in the diagram, right? And that'd be unrealistic to assume everybody's doing everything. However, there are many that are doing lots of pieces of the puzzle. So I'm going to explain those along the way and give you some real-world case studies of where we've done that. And I'll refer back to this diagram to kind of keep us on track as to where we're headed. So I'm guessing you've all seen a version of this slide once or twice before. Everybody gets Alfresco and gets what it is. And I'll just remind you that from a content hub, it's really well suited, right? It's really an outstanding integration platform. And that's certainly something we talk about with our customers and our prospects when they consider how to solve document management, content management problems, right? One of the first things I make sure people know is Alfresco is a platform. You're not necessarily going to solve everything that you can imagine right out of the box. And I think that's a really important thing for folks to realize is you're addressing with content management solutions, right? You're not buying commercially off-the-shelf software to solve broad content management problems. I don't think those solutions really exist. Talk a little bit about Alfresco One and this play. And I think the really important thing to capture here, there's a couple pieces, but the cloud obviously is important to all of our business, right? It's important to Alfresco, that's clear. We're only going to be successful as we figure out how to function in a cloud-enabled world. I think it's really interesting. I sat in an AIM event in the US, and I think it was in Atlanta a few weeks ago. I've traveled a lot, so now I don't remember where I am anymore. But John Mancini told a story to the audience. There were 150 people in the room, and he was talking about a case where a company with whom they were working wanted to share something with him. And they said, oh yeah, well, we'll just put it on Dropbox and you can get it. And they shared with him a Dropbox folder, and he thought, fantastic. And when he got around to checking it, they accidentally shared their entire company hierarchy on Dropbox, which included things like HR records and personnel files and compensation history, things that you probably shouldn't ever put on Dropbox that were out there. And I find this story, well, A, that's ridiculous and don't use Dropbox that way, but also this idea of Alfresco's Cloud Sync really is a pretty compelling offering, right? So you retain IT governance over your information using a cloud-based solution, whether it's Alfresco Cloud or perhaps a private cloud type of offering and using on-premise to on-premise syncing as they alluded to this morning. But you can avoid what is a very real problem with that kind of a solution. So I thought that was pretty compelling. I don't think you can have a presentation now without talking about the cloud, so there's my requisite cloud slide. Everything that we're talking about in the presentation today is cloud enabled, right? You get that about Alfresco, but all these other pieces of the puzzle that we're describing, and again, I'll come around to some specific examples, are bits and pieces of software that run effectively in the cloud today, and it's a matter of how you integrate those solutions to solve your business problems. So I'll start by talking a little bit about Ephesoft. For those of you who aren't familiar with Ephesoft, they're a document capture provider. They're competitors with the other major players in that space. They're complementary to Alfresco in a lot of ways. They're an open source solution. They're licensed comparably to what you've seen with Alfresco. So all of the pieces there in terms of just how that solution works is something you're probably familiar with. So let's just explain a little bit about the tool and why we find it pretty compelling as we implement the capture portion of the ECM problem with our customers. So, you know, it's a fancy automated slide I borrowed from one of my colleagues. The first thing that the Ephesoft solution does is, and this is part of its training process, but really what it's doing is it has an ability to automatically classify or determine what content is. And a story I can share with you, we've worked with a nonprofit organization in the US called Heifer International. And they're a charitable organization, and you donate to them to generate sustainable food sources around the world. So they're helping folks in Africa, for example, learn how to farm. And they collect donations, and throughout their busy season, which is essentially now through the end of the year, around the holidays, they hire approximately 35 temporary employees, and those temporary employees are responsible for opening up a lot of incoming mail, identifying what that mail is, sorting it, labeling it, and running it through a scanner so that then they can capture the details about that. And usually it's including some form of a donation, like a check or credit card information, something in the form of an order form. They have a concept of donating. You can donate a cow, for example, which is an idea. You donate dollars. They apply that appropriately where need is found. But you know, imagine a scenario where they have all these temp employees, and their whole job is just to figure out what it is they've got. And one of the things that's neat and why they're going to pursue an Ephesoft solution, we're in kind of the middle of an implementation with them, is because they can avoid that sorting problem. It's a very human problem for them. So this system will automatically figure it out. As part of its learning process, it'll recognize now what it is you've told it to expect. So, for example, we've taught it what a check is, and it figures it out in this example. And from there, it automatically identifies the things that you're feeding it. So they don't have to label, barcode any of their incoming pieces. Got some other stories in using the product as well. I'll share with you in a bit. But at that moment, you can imagine, right, like any other capture tool, it can go ahead and perform the metadata extraction. It can pull off the pieces that it cares about. Why is this interesting in our conversation? Well, two things. They're using standards-based API to connect with back-end repositories. So as part of that process, after it's done its classification and it's done its metadata extraction, you've now got a composite document, right? You've got a binary, and you've got the metadata pieces about that. How do you get that into a repository? What we've done is use CMIS as that vehicle. And it's a simple create document call across the wire from Ephesoft to Alfresco. What they've also done on the other end is they've actually made a use case that we never really thought about as we were developing the CMIS spec, and I didn't disclose that earlier, but I still sit on the CMIS technical committee with some of my peers here at Alfresco. And as we developed that specification, we were thinking in terms of content repositories and tools like portals, right, and how you interoperate with those things. But what the Ephesoft team did is they said, well, we have a use case where you can send documents into our system using CMIS. They're not a repository in any way, and yet they support essentially a create document call as how do you store things or how do you start the process with Ephesoft. I thought that was pretty neat from an integration perspective. They're cloud-enabled as well. Just a shameless plug here as we go. There is a new book out from Ephesoft. We're co-authors with the Ephesoft team, and there's a lot to be learned about the product in the book. It's available now. We have a sample up at our booth and some discount cards if you're interested at all or have any interest in capture. Please come by and take a look. Okay, so where are we going from here? I talked about Ephesoft, and just to kind of frame it again, you know, that inbound arrow from paper or scanner into Ephesoft can be a CMIS pipe, and then again, it is CMIS from Ephesoft to Alfresco. We're going to jump down in our diagram and talk about mobile here for a while. I would ask the trick question. I think some of my audience members have seen this slide before, but you know, so this is not Larry Ellison's net worth, but rather the number of mobile smartphones in China as of June, I think June or July this year. And I was confirming my data earlier this morning, and I've learned that the percentage is up, so I'm sure that number is small. But of the worldwide smartphone market, 26% is held by the People's Republic of China. So they have a really, really large amount, right, of folks using mobile devices. In the June timeframe, when we originally were putting some of these slides together, the market share of Apple devices there was a scant 16%, which is significant, especially given that number. But I thought it was interesting in the audience today that, you know, about half the folks were Droid and half the folks were iOS folks raising their hands. Very interesting as you think about mobile. I was tweeting back and forth with Peter Monks, which you shouldn't do, by the way, but we were debating whether or not, you know, what we would see, how many iOS folks, how many Android folks, and I suspect we're going to see a much different ratio next week in the US. We'll probably see a lot more Apple folks. But nonetheless, right, Android's not to be ignored. So as we think about mobile story, I have some Apple facts here, but note that we're, of course, at Alfresco as well as within Zia, thinking on both platforms. Apple has, again, these are some older facts, a few months old, so pre-iPad mini and so on. Nearly every one of the Fortune 500 companies are deploying or in some capacity testing iOS devices. So, you know, as you sit here and ask yourself, well, does it matter to me? The answer is almost certainly yes. Maybe not today, but certainly in the next 6 to 18 months, you're gonna run into this need in your organizations. You know, there's a lot of iPads out there, and then the minis and the other tablets are certainly not going away. Another thing so Morgan Stanley did some analysis on tablet forecasting, and they revised a forecast of how many tablets would be used worldwide in business earlier this year, and they didn't just revise it by 10 or 15 or 20%. I think they revised it by a full order of magnitude year over year from their original estimates. So that's pretty significant when a respected analyst firm like that, you know, I wouldn't call that missing. I don't think that's a fair way to characterize what happened, but, you know, just the adoption rate of tablets in the enterprise was much, much faster than any of us could have anticipated. So is it real? I think these facts and many others indicate absolutely yes. And that all sets the stage for a conversation around enterprise mobile CMS. So let me share with you a little bit about where we play there and some of the things that we're doing as we think about mobility and content management. A little bit of maybe our background here and the areas in which we're focusing. I'll share with you a story with the city and county of Denver. So many of you, if you've done any of the Alfresco case study reading, have probably seen a little bit about Denver, with whom we've worked for about 3 years back in the US. We implemented a 311 tool there in the city. 311 is the equivalent of a non-emergency number that you might call if you had an issue to report with your locality. So in the US, if you call 311, you can get an operator and you can say, hey, there's a dog roaming my neighborhood, for example, and they might send out animal control. They, for a lot of reasons, were looking for a mobile solution, and we helped them build an iOS tool. And this is an interesting one because we tied it ultimately back to Alfresco, and I'll circle back to that. But imagine that scenario of a loose dog in your neighborhood, and you wish to report that and get animal control to come out and deal with it. If you take a photograph, you have now generated evidence. You've given enough information, or you can create enough information for the city to do something about it. At that moment, you have now a geotagged piece of evidence, so you have a location. What we did is we worked with Denver. They used an enterprise service bus. In that case, it was Oracle. Opened up some methods and generated, through a service bus call, an integration between Alfresco and Oracle ERP, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe it was CRM. I'm losing my train of thought there. What we built, though, what was really interesting about it was we took that content, right, that photograph, and dropped it in Alfresco as a system of record. And then the ticket was created on the CRM side, and all of a sudden, without any human having to be involved except for the individual who took the photograph, the city was able to dispatch animal control. Whereas before, you'd have to talk to a person and then have to type it all in and so on. It's a pretty, and again, I don't know if anybody's were thinking about when they developed Alfresco using that tool in that manner as a document repository, and yet the city really, embraced that use case. So switching over a little bit, maybe more closer to home, why do we really care about enterprise mobility? Perhaps the most obvious thing is a C-level executive gets their iPad or their iPad mini or whatever device, and is unable to perform part of their job function that they would typically perform on their laptop. Why can't they do part of their job with that form factor, or maybe not as effectively as they would like? Companies want productivity anywhere, right? It's no longer about, in terms of enterprise mobility, in terms of the sales force being mobile, right? That's not the only use case that enterprises care about. I'm sure most of you are like us. You have a lot of employees that work remotely or are working when they're not in the office, whether they're typically remote employees or not, just simply because they have access to their own devices. They're bringing their own devices into the enterprise. Another study that we read recently suggests that, if you're an organization that embraces bring your own device, your employees are probably going to work 20 hours a week more than they would have otherwise. I don't know if that's incentive or not, but it's still a reality, right? As a business, you have to solve or address those problems, and there's certainly, you're leaving something on the table if you don't. Okay, so what do we care about with Enterprise Mobile CMS? Organizations absolutely care about branding. I think we're all clear on the fact that our organizations in some capacity are vain, and having our logos and our color schemes actually matter. Having personalized behavior, having access to workflow, having actual integration to your back-end processes are all important. But don't forget that now you're creating an SLA for your IT organization by having an enterprise mobile rollout. These things aren't simple to address and to manage. And I'm not sure if Luis actually talked about that before, but it's a real interesting problem that we see. And just don't forget that there's actually a cost there. So let me tell you about 3 areas where we've done mobile development and how they all come back to Alfresco. Several years ago, my colleague in the front row here, Mike, in his spare time, decided to write an iOS client and ultimately wrote a CMIS-based application called FreshDocs that browsed to Alfresco. And that's matured over several years now to a variety of use cases. I would tell you, as you go through, if you were to pull the app down out of the App Store today, you'll see it looks strikingly similar to another mobile tool we'll talk about in a second, because it's the child, it's the father, if you will, of Alfresco Mobile. So for those of you that don't know, we contributed the initial code, and over the past, I don't know, what's it been, 18 months, have been an active participant with Alfresco in the development of the Alfresco Mobile tool. And so FreshDocs is our CMIS version of that tool, without the Alfresco specific goodies that can talk to multiple repositories. Of course, you're familiar with Alfresco Mobile. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time there because, again, you guys have all heard that. But there's another story that's worth telling that is what's next. What's beyond what we've already seen, and how do we get a bit more interesting in the mobile space? So let me spend a second and just introduce one of our other business partners. And you may be familiar with the German organization WeWebU. At the end of the day, they're a product organization. They have, in their history, an IBM background. I'm going to talk with you a little bit about who they are because it introduces a story around mobile here that we're working with them on that I think is really interesting. So this is the old way, I think, of enterprise mobile or mobile. You know, now we've got Apple and Android devices, and we really are evolving the way we're playing here. So this is my analogy for you know, why we're moving beyond Alfresco Mobile and FreshDocs at Zia. So we're talking about a story around transactional content management, or what I would maybe more generally call case management as a mobile experience. And so just by way of explanation here, and you saw on my broader solution slide a few minutes ago, this OpenWorkdesk as a UI to Alfresco it is, and happy to talk about it. It's a fantastic role-based case management tool that works really, really well with Alfresco and other repositories. We're rolling it out with a number of customers. In the slides this morning, you saw one of our customers up there as well that's using this tool as a case management utility for their legal organization, for example. It's a pretty powerful additional user interface beyond what Alfresco Share offers. But why again does it matter? Well, you know, once again, Enterprise CMS has these specific requirements, and they're kind of not to be ignored. And so, in a collaborative partnership with WeWebU, we've begun and are now shipping a new product we call Mobile Workdesk, which is a tablet version of the OpenWorkdesk tool with a bunch of other interesting features beyond. You know, so not only is it just taking that case management application to the tablet, but it's adding something really interesting beyond that. It's adding a personalized experience. So, and what I mean by that is in fact, the actual user experience of the product changes given who you are. So not only do I just get what I would out of a normal content repository, right, with security and access control and so on, but I get a user behavior change based on the fact that I might be an HR person over an engineering employee in my organization. From a technology perspective, we're using ultimately CMIS behind the covers here as well. And there's a few places where, for example, you know, activity is not covered by the CMIS spec. So workflow doesn't surface that way. But we're using that standard as well to kind of tie this together. So, you know, again, why do you care? Well, you know, the other apps, not to disparage what we've done or what Alfresco or anybody else has done, but the other apps that are available today have taken a one-size-fits-all approach. I said, you know, it doesn't matter who you are. You get a traditional content repository experience. You get access to, you know, the things that you have access to, and you can maybe edit or delete or whatever, perform those typical content operations based on the fact that you're that individual, which works fantastically. But we think there's something more to be had. And so what makes this product a little more interesting is we've taken an approach to put a server layer in between the mobile client and the back-end repository, right, in between Alfresco. And that tool provides this custom personalized experience to the mobile client, right? Everything from branding, literally you can control the look and feel of the application through the server-based configuration, to defining role-based activity, again, where your function of your application changes depending on who you are. And so, you now are moving into a scenario where your HR and your claims and your customers and so on, and all of your users have a different experience, again, based on their job function. We find this really compelling. You know, why are we telling the story? You know, from an overall integration perspective, again, is that you know, it's rounding out, right? When you think about the fact that your organizations have content everywhere and how you might address that, well, not only do you address getting that content managed and under control, but you have to think about how you're going to surface that. And this is one of many ways, of course, that with Alfresco, you can surface your content. So I'm moving on to some specific integration stories. We've chosen a partnership around integration with MuleSoft. So I'll just talk about them for a second, and then we'll move into some interesting case conversations as we continue. Mule, much like WeWebU, much like Ephesoft and Alfresco, has an open source pedigree. They open source their ESB product that we're using in many of our integration stories. They are also, at the end of the day, cloud enabled. So, for those of you who aren't familiar with an ESB and you've done integrations before, you may have written point-to-point based integrations like the slide hints at, right? And you've built something from your Alfresco to your database to your SAP, for example. And what the ESB does is allow you to use a pluggable architecture and use reusable integration components. So you don't have to do that as much. We have, well, I'll come back to that in a second. They also have a cloud story as well. You probably aren't surprised to hear that. Well, one of the things that we've done with them to maybe make this a bit more real is we've developed an application combining a handful of tools. We used, obviously, the ESB in the cloud. We used Alfresco, and we used an invoice processing system called Intact and built what they call an iApp, which is just a packaged application. Mule has the belief that organizations are going to begin to purchase at an application and a solution level in many cases, as opposed to at framework levels. And so that framework, or that particular solution, combines inbound invoice processing from Ephesoft and then stores that generated document metadata in Alfresco, as I've described already, and then uses the Intact system to actually process the invoice itself and generate the payment integration. And they sell that as a complete tool, so you don't have to individually license those various components and write those integrations yourself. But maybe a bit more real for this audience is, so great. What does that actually mean for me? I talked about one of the cases over at Denver from 311. I'll talk about a couple of these others. We're working with Synopsys now. So Synopsys, if you haven't heard of them, is a chip maker based in Silicon Valley. They make component chips for organizations like Cisco, for example. And they have a knowledge-based system that exists already. They have a homegrown authoring environment that is directly connected to an HTML-based publishing, so it's kind of a WCM use case that they've home built. And then they have a CRM system that they're tracking support tickets through as well. And they have no real relationship today from a support ticket to a knowledge article to really relate those things together and know if the content that they're creating for their users is addressing the challenges their users are facing. We got engaged with them a handful of months ago and are replacing the authoring environment. That was a homegrown thing, and we're using Alfresco for that. And it's got an office integration that works really well for them. And we're going to build a transformation service via Mule ESB and connect the authoring environment to their existing publishing environment. And it turns out they're happy with their publishing environment. They don't really see a need to change that. But they want their authors to author in Word. For the most part, that's what folks are comfortable with. And so they think that they can, given the fact that there's a standard around doc files, that there can be a transformation of that into a well-known format given the section on the site where that knowledge article belongs. And using Mule and creating a transformation service push that into their publishing environment. Another piece of the puzzle there, and why this is interesting, is we're also connecting to SAP CRM for them. And in that case, we're relating the actual ticket for help, the customer support ticket, with the actual knowledge articles that exist in Alfresco. And they're going to use that for some form of essentially business intelligence, right? They want to figure out the value add of the content they have, how relevant, how current it is, can it be replaced, is it still interesting? Do true analytics on their website. And so that combination of tools, once again, Alfresco, MuleSoft, homegrown publishing, and SAP CRM, is addressing a real business challenge that they're facing. And it's a combination of technologies, right? So we're using CMIS for a part of that. We're clearly using Alfresco's SharePoint integration or SharePoint protocol support for the Office integration piece. And then there's some homegrown pieces with Mule as well. I won't steal any more thunder here. We've got another session tomorrow that talks about integration with ESBs and what we've done with the U.S. Department of Agriculture that Mike's giving. So I'd encourage you to join that if you're interested in the story. I'd like to hear in more detail kind of how that works and what the configuration looks like, and see code and go beyond what I'm covering today. Okay, so back to our colorful picture here. I've talked about the paper portion and the consumption of content, and I've explained how that could be exposed over a variety of mobile platforms out of Alfresco ultimately. And then I've also tried to share an integration story, or several integration stories with MuleSoft and other ESBs along the way. So to the right, I did talk about OpenWorkdesk, and of course you all know Share, so I'm not going to cover that, but I'll spend a second and cover something on Liferay, and then I've got a couple other customer stories that are interesting, and that'll wrap us up. So for those of you who don't know Liferay, and you've probably gathered this about us already, it's another open source tool. It's a portal product. They're the open source leader around enterprise portals, so they're going to compete with the likes of Oracle and Web Center, or what was BEA WebLogic Portal, one of their many portals, or the IBM Suite. They've been around a while. They're the standard, we think, and they think, in the portal space in open source. And we're doing some work there as well with Liferay. Not a whole lot, but as an alternative when Share is not a UI experience that works for our customers, Liferay often is, or perhaps OpenWorkdesk, again, depending on the particular use cases of our customers. So what I've hoped to do is explain some of the ideas around solutions. I'll give you, again, some case studies in a second, but connecting the dots here. And I guess what I would tell you is this, as technical folks, none of the pieces that we've bit off for our clients in addressing this vision have been wholesale, right? I think I said that in the beginning. We're not going to go work with anyone and do all of these things all at once. That's an easy way to fail, and in our case, not be asked back. And so we'd rather work on smaller pieces, fail fast, do things in an agile manner. I would certainly encourage you all to think in similar ways as you build those kinds of integrations. It sounds obvious, but I think it's worth saying out loud. Just a bit more about who we are. This is my only Who Zia Is slide. We're the current Alfresco Partner of the Year in the Americas. We're out of Denver or Boulder, Colorado, if you didn't know that already. We're also the Partner of the Year for Ephesoft as well. And of course, we're partnered with the other organizations we were talking about. So 3 quick stories here on our customers that are doing bits and pieces of what I've described beyond what I've already shared. The first is Iron Mountain. I think Iron Mountain was on the slide this morning. They're a worldwide organization. Personally, I actually didn't know a whole lot about them when we began to work with them. I knew that they had the box in past offices where I've worked that I would drop my paper to be shredded and never be seen again. And I knew they had trucks driving around picking up boxes of paper and sticking them in caves somewhere. Quite literally, they do that in the U.S., put them in caves. What I didn't realize is they have an online digital records management tool. And their older implementation of that was based on an IBM product. And they attempted to implement multi-tenancy and failed. They struggled, and so they decided, well, the only way they know how to support what they have was every time a new customer came online for them, they'd spin up a new virtual machine and run a whole new instance of that repository, which, needless to say, wasn't cheap, but also wasn't in any way maintainable. So you might imagine if they had 250 customers and they needed to patch an operating system, now they've got to touch 250 virtual machines. They would quite literally get to the case where a patch would happen and they'd be in the middle of applying a patch across all their instances, and they wouldn't finish before the next patch became available. So they just had a forever maintenance problem. They actually found us because of our FreshDocs tool. They came in looking for, they were thinking about Alfresco as a potential replacement. They were asking us about mobile and Alfresco, and we asked them a little bit about the business problem they were trying to solve, and heard their multi-tenant challenge. And we ended up working with them. At the end of the day, we assessed Alfresco multi-tenancy and decided for their particular use case it wasn't the right answer. and implemented a share-based, using share sites, multi-tenant solution. And we've appropriately segmented things like the content model away and workflows and so on. So those things are independently represented for their various customers. And then we've also used records management in that solution as well. And we've really generated what is from a customer's perspective, a true multi-tenant solution that's a digital records management tool. They have, given that their business is largely paper, I don't even know how to describe how big, a ridiculously large amount of paper consumption that they're digitizing for their customers that's all going to ultimately end up in this system. So they've completed those pieces of the puzzle. What else are they doing? At the end of the day, they're intending to represent all of the content that they're storing as digital records for their clients and make that available through mobile tools as well. They move pretty darn slow given the kind of business that they run. So I'm not sure their time frame anymore for when that'll happen. But as a kind of a real world functional example, they're doing what is a pretty significant portion of the diagram before. Another couple of stories around Denver. So you heard a mobile story, and one of the ways they're using Alfresco a handful of slides ago. There's a couple others. We implemented for them a contracting automation solution using actually Explorer. We used this. It's so long ago that we did it using the Explorer UI before Share had Workflow exposed. So Share was around, but Workflow wasn't available, and they needed to move. And so we had a business case for them where they, every time the city initiated a contract for services, so for example, they needed to get a road paved or needed to pay a software vendor or anything along those lines, they had a paper-based contracting process, and it moved through approximately 15 departments all the way to the mayor of the city who had to physically sign a document for a contract to be authorized. And in extenuating circumstances, that could take as long as 3 months. And quite literally, they'd have a 100-page contract, and from one department to another, it would move on a mail cart, get photocopied and marked up, scanned, and printed out again. And so after 15 departments, you can imagine they've got a couple thousand extra pieces of paper they didn't need. No one knew where anything was, and you weren't clear on legally who were signing documents. And we used Alfresco Workflow as a way to automate that process to the point where their contracting time takes on the average 21 days now. And there's full visibility into the process at all times, and we've also implemented an electronic signature component on top of that. Another case with Denver really quickly here is we've implemented a scanning project for them, all going into the same Alfresco server that holds the 311 data and the contracting data. We're working with the Health and Human Services Department for the city, and in that case, they're scanning actual case files of folks that are working with the city to get some form of assistance. So, for example, housing assistance or food stamps in the U.S., something like that. And there were cases in the past where folks would actually be approved for example, housing assistance, and then they'd get evicted before the process could complete, and they could actually receive the assistance. So we help them implement a scanning solution to get all of their content digitized and managed in a much more quick manner than it was before. So just tying the pieces together. In those three examples, right, they're kind of three independent uses of Alfresco and integration, and yet, from the city's perspective, they're seeing it as ultimately implementing a paper and mobile vision. That's certainly the way they're looking at the use of Alfresco. I'd also tell you that just one other quick data point for them, they started with 14 specific individual ECM systems in-house when we first met them. So in the next few months, they won't be using Documentum anymore. We got rid of another system called Liberty along the way. That's the first thing we did. There's some others that we're talking about over the next year. So they've made the decision to use Alfresco, period, as their repository. And of course, as you imagine, it's impossible for them to move very quickly to move all those out. But, I think I've heard that story so many times from folks that have many, many, many systems in place. And it's become a real challenge for them to manage. One more story here. In this example, we're working with a financial services company in the U.S. It's an organization called the Church Pension Group in Manhattan. They're providing the financial services for the Episcopal Church. So all of, I believe it's worldwide, all of the clergy members and their life insurance and their human resources and anything else. They're about a $10 billion fund that they manage. They're a pretty significant amount of dollars. But in terms of an organization, they're not very large, maybe 500 employees, and largely in IT capacity. Maybe the most interesting story with them, they're using Alfresco, as you might expect, across multiple departments. And they're integrating it with CRM and ERP and thinking about a service bus, and they've got case management and a bunch of neat use cases. But the single, I think, most interesting story with them is actually a paper one. They're, at the end of the year here, moving from one office to another, and they have 2 full floors of downtown Manhattan real estate occupied by filing cabinets. And they calculated on a square foot basis, just the file cabinets themselves, how much real estate cost it was costing them, and it was $13 million of file cabinet real estate. So they said, well, we're not going to move the paper when we move. Just going to get rid of it, and we're going to digitize it all by the end of the year. And they've been using a combination of solutions to make that happen, but ultimately getting it all into Alfresco. So once again, I think it's a validation of this idea, this solution, this vision that we've described as paper to mobile. So with that, if you're interested in learning any more, I'm happy to entertain some questions. We've got a booth out there. We've got obviously all this on the website. We've got little USB sticks with some case studies as well. I'll note as well, we're also responsible for the Ephesoft training. So we authored and are generally the trainers during their training classes. I'll take questions or happy to talk to people after that. I think we've got 3 minutes. All right, thank you for your time.